Welcome, dear listeners, to another bone-chilling episode of Unveiling Nightmares. I'm your host, C.A. Bainham, and today we have a special guest with us. Our guest today is none other than Stephen Kozeniewski. Sorry if I said that wrong. The author of Braineater Jones and Clickers Never Die. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Crystal. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an author of horror and science fiction, and sometimes I like to blend the two. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I also, in my what little spare time I have, I also help to run a balloon studio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So tell me about your books without giving away any spoilers.
About specifically those two, or just in general?
Oh, in general, any ones that you want to talk about.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Braineater Jones. That's probably that was my first novel, and it's probably still my most popular. So that one is about a zombie detective who wakes up dead with amnesia, and he has to set out to solve his own murder. And people really love that one. It's actually the 10-year anniversary. That came out in 2013. And the 10-year anniversary edition is going to be coming out this year from Thunderstorm Books.
Yeah.
And I've gone back a couple of times. I've written a couple of short stories with Jones. I haven't really gone back and done a proper follow-up novel, but I know people have been itching to get that. But in the meantime, I've been delving deeper into some splatterpunk and extreme horror, but also other stuff, science fiction, that kind of thing. So you mentioned Clickers Never Die. That was really cool when Brian Keene asked my collaborator Wiley Young and I to essentially pick up the baton for the Clickers series.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was our big grand guignol, over the top, crazy munch out horror epic.
Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. So what are the biggest influences on your work, especially when it comes to creating the darkness?
Sure. Well, like I mentioned Brian Keene. So I've probably told this story 1,000 times, but I was a big fan for many years. And, I read all of his stuff. I read The Rising and City of the Dead. And, I was a big zombie fan. I still am, of course. Mm. And, Keene really had a big influence on me. And then we met in real life. And I think he probably saw something genuine in me that I wasn't just another fan. Or are we allowed to swear?
Yeah, you carry on.
Okay. I'm not just another fucking fan or just another fucking climber, and grew to be friends in real life, which is, to this day, it's still kind of surreal, but,
yeah.
Like through him, I got to meet some other influences. I'm glad I got to meet Jack Ketchum, a few years before he passed away. I haven't read a ton of, I hadn't until I got into the scene read a ton of contemporary horror. But back when I was a kid, I read all the Poe, I read all the Lovecraft. There was sort of, it's funny, I always joke that, I wasn't allowed to watch scary movies, and I wasn't allowed to play with guns growing up. So naturally I grew up to join the army and become a horror author. But that's absolutely true. I kind of have this big gap in my pop culture experience where my friends are all like, oh yeah, I've watched Friday the 13th 1,000 times. And I'm like, I was never allowed to watch that kind of thing. But my parents did kind of have a hole in that very, in my opinion, stupid policy that they didn't consider classics to be horror. This was in the 80s and 90s. So there was the big, satanic panic, and everything was a slasher. So my mom always insisted that I couldn't watch slasher movies, which ranged from, Gremlins to anything.
Yeah.
But they never quite caught on to the fact that I could read Frankenstein or Dracula or Poe or Lovecraft or something like that. And while it was a classic, it was also horror. So I did sneak in I guess I did pretty well on catching up with some of the classics when I was younger.
That's great. I mean, I read The Exorcist when I was told not to when I was younger.
Sure.
Brilliant book. So, yeah, you do kind of rebel, don't you? Kind of, sort of, when you're at that age.
Yeah, you definitely do. I was never very good at rebelling, though. I know we were pretty explicitly not allowed to read Stephen King. My sister did sometimes. I still never have.
Okay. Have you got any insights into your creative process and any rituals that you like to follow when you're writing?
Well, sure. I know there's this big divide in the publishing industry, and it's kind of silly to me in some ways because I just want to say, write however you want to write and create however you want to create. But a lot of people like to divide it into plotters and pantsers, meaning those who extensively plot and those who fly by, quote unquote, fly by the seat of their pants.
Yeah.
And, I've never really fallen squarely into either category. So, the closest I ever came to like purely pantsing was probably Braineater Jones because I just wrote that. I tried to capture a stream of consciousness. Like reading Braineater Jones is basically reading my thought process, like to the extent that I could. I tried to put everything down on paper with that because he's so much in his own head, trying to get his thoughts out on paper. But even so, I had written down the rules of the world, and I established kind of what the framework was for that. So my creative process, I don't really subscribe to either of those camps. And yeah, sometimes I will just sit down and kind of vomit out a book fully formed, but other times I'll get really excited about doing all the world building. And I actually I have more worlds than novels at this point. I've got a number of Bibles on my hard drive that I've never even gotten around to creating the stories for. But in terms of, I think you used the word rituals. I do like to sometimes light a candle or have a cup of coffee, and my partner often makes fun of me because I'll drink coffee at any time of the day, night or day. Doesn't really affect me or keep me up or anything any more so than usual.
Same.
You're the same way?
Yeah, I drink coffee all the time.
Okay, good. It's funny. I just you're where, London?
West Midlands, UK.
West Midlands. Okay. I just visited the UK for the first time this summer, and we found it so hard to find a cup of what I guess we would call Americano. There were plenty of places where we could get espresso and stuff, but
yeah,
even the hotel rooms, they didn't have coffee bars; they had tea kettles set up and stuff. And we were like, "Where are we supposed to get coffee in this, island?"
As he picks up a cup.
I know it makes great radio for your podcasting audience there. But yeah, coffee, candles. I do have a whiteboard. I've kind of gone back and forth on the whole whiteboard thing. I know some people swear by it and they just can't get through the day without putting all their projects up, or even, plotting out their stories on a whiteboard. And I also know people, and again, this is not to diminish anybody's creative process, but I know people where before they can even start writing, they need to clip out thousands of pictures of dresses from a magazine and say, oh, well, this is what my main character would have worn. And, this is how this character speaks, and this is what they look like. And here's pictures of actors and actresses. And, before they can even get into that place where they can write a novel. And I've never really done a whole lot of that. Like I said, I'll do some world building, but not to that extent.
Yeah, I'm sort of like a mixture. Some books I will plot out, others I'll just go with the flow.
Yeah.
So have you faced any sort of challenges in this genre, and how do you overcome them?
Um, so I guess I'm guessing about where you're going with this question, but I guess I haven't really had a lot of challenges with like the traumatic, impact of anything. I mean, if anything, I find writing can be kind of cathartic, and there are definitely times. Sometimes I tell this story. I used to have a very weird sensation about my neck. Some people are like this, where they have various, they don't want to be touched on their, less than such part of their body, or they're sensitive to this or that. And I very much had a concern about something happening to my neck, and I would kind of cringe from that kind of thing until I wrote a very explicit horror story about someone's, throat being cut very viscerally, and then I was kind of over it.
Yeah.
Because it turns out it was a psychological thing and not a neurological thing. So that part I don't have a ton of trouble with. But to answer your question, the biggest problem I have with this industry is getting exposure and getting interest. And I try not to be bouncing off the walls, because I'm very much I was actually chatting with Kit Power today, and he was saying that he subscribes to the belief that you should just keep releasing good quality books and eventually you'll get noticed.
Yeah.
And I try to keep to that. I'm like, the best thing I can do is write really, really good things. But I have also, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, been kind of throwing all the spaghetti against the wall in terms of getting a niche, getting a market, getting interest. And, I've done things like I've released books with kind of like fantastical titles when that was very popular. I can't seem to get any traction with that. Or, I'll try and go viral on TikTok or this and that, or I'll try to key into what the various, fashions and trends and that kind of thing are. And it's just really, really hard to get over that great big shrug that you're greeted with by most readers.
Yeah.
It's soul crushing a lot of the time.
I know the hardest thing, I mean, some people say the hardest thing about writing is actually the marketing afterwards.
Oh, yes.
You're getting out there. It is quite hard, especially, I would say, probably for self-publishers, but I don't know about the published people who've been published by big houses. I don't know about that side. But I know for self-publishers like myself, it is quite hard trying to market books.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And all of the people that I've spoken to that had Big Five deals, they say much the same thing. They're like, it's not the way it was in the 60s. Or, I guess in some ways we treat those past eras as though they were much better, and they may not have been. But it's very much not the way that we assume it was back before we were all born, I assume. They're like, oh, yeah, I'm expected to, pay for my own book tours. I need to sell this much or they're going to drop me. I knew one guy who'll go nameless. I guess he had a 3-book contract with one of the Big Five, and they just really screwed him because they weren't happy with the sales in the first book. So they just did nothing with the second book. They just basically like dropped it and were like, yeah, good luck. Yeah. And like in a way to force him to reach that contract breaking point to where he was selling so few copies that they could just break the contract on the third one. So I don't think you like to hope it gets better with the more traditional publishing, but who's to say?
It is quite hard marketing a book and actually getting out there to be noticed. It's not as easy as everybody thinks it is.
Yeah.
Okay. So have you got any memorable reactions that stand out to you from your readers?
Yeah, I'll tell you what's one of the funniest things for me is when I have readers that look at books and I'm not going to front. I'm not going to pretend like I'm too good to read my own reviews. I know I gather that's kind of a point of pride for some authors. Like, oh, no, I don't read my reviews. But for your listeners, I can assure you, every author reads every review.
Yeah.
And I know some authors who are quite literally world class, and I have proof that they read all of their own reviews. So, but in any case, I try not to front about that because I find that to be another very silly thing, like the plotters versus pantsers thing. But one of the things that I find very amusing in the reactions is when I'll have two readers with diametrically opposed reactions. So I wrote the Hemtophages, and I guess the secret's out now. The book's been out for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
But I wrote this science fiction horror book. It's along the lines of The Thing or Event Horizon. And if you think back to The Thing, it's an all-male cast. And I wanted to do that, but I wanted to do it in reverse and see if anybody would notice. So I wrote an all-female cast, and in fact, I took it a step further because it wasn't just a bottle episode like The Thing is set in the Antarctic and nobody would come in from outside. But I made it so there are no males left in the universe. And I didn't give any explanation. It was just an unspoken element of the novel. And ever since, people have asked me, why are there no men left? Why are there no more men? Why are there no more men? And I'm like, okay, well, read the book, read into it. What's your takeaway? Like, I'm not trying to be coy. I'm just like, yeah, you're right. I used some subtext instead of just outright telling everybody why the men all died off. And with that book, I have had reactions where they're like, it was so good. The female perspective was so good. I forgot I was reading a man. And I've had reactions where they're like, this is just what a man thinks that a cool girl acts like. And all he's ever watched to research this was The Office. That was a very strange one. Somebody was like, this is what somebody who's never watched anything but The Office thinks women look like. And I was like, what on earth does that mean? But even with that very concept, that was one of the most exciting reactions that I ever had was when the secret started to get out about that, and people started saying when they realized. So there were some people that were like, I went into the book, I got all the way to the end, and then I read another review that said, hey, did you notice there was no men? And then I had some people that were like, oh yeah, I noticed around chapter 3, but I didn't know if it was a plot point. And then there are other people that were like, oh yeah, I realized by chapter 1 because some of the characters would like by default be a male, but he never did that. So that was one of the more interesting reactions that I've had.
Okay, so can you share your vision for how extreme horror is going to go?
So my vision or my anticipation, like what do I think is going to happen or what do I hope is going to happen?
Yeah, what do you think and what you hope?
Both. Okay. Yeah, that's because as I'm thinking about it, those are two very different things. My expectation is, I'm not calling out anyone in particular, but I already think that there is kind of a glut in the market. There is a ton of splatterpunk and extreme horror out there. And I think people are going to get tired of it because there's no way to possibly keep up and read every short story on Godless and read every novel that comes out, everywhere. And also there's a point where it gets repetitive. And even for somebody like me, where my bread and butter is, splatterpunk and extreme horror, and I've read a ton of, that kind of stuff, I'm like, I need to read something different. So like, I forget what all I read, this year, but, I'll stop and be like, okay, I need to read some science fiction. Or I stopped and I read, I know what the last thing I read that was a little bit different was Christopher Buehlman's Between Two Fires, which was like a dark fantasy.
Yeah.
So I think that the market is going to be oversaturated, and then the bottom's going to kind of fall out, because at what point can you keep producing the same stuff and readers will keep consuming it? I think you'll reach a limit on that.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to I think the bottom's going to kind of fall out in probably the next year or two, if it's not already kind of. And then there'll be kind of a re-examining, and then I think high quality extreme horror and splatterpunk is going to come to the fore again. So, people like Christopher Triana, that are almost bridging the gap between the literary and beautiful work and extreme horror. I think they're going to really break out. Although now that I'm saying it, I guess that's partially my vision too. So, when you think about things like how, say, for instance, science fiction was regarded in the 1930s. It was pulp, it was crap, it was disposable, it was to be gotten rid of.
Yeah.
You bought a magazine and then you throw it out. And then by the 50s, there was some understanding that some works of science fiction were worth keeping around, but generally it was still regarded as pulp. And then it evolves into, oh, well, we have our classics, we have our Dune, we have our Foundation, and that kind of thing. I am hoping, splatterpunk and extreme horror has been around since the 80s, and I hope that we will start to have our versions of those great epics, that we'll start to have our Dune and our Lord of the Rings, and the kind of seminal, like, oh, look, here's what extreme horror and splatterpunk at its apex can be. And I think we're at about the point where that's going to start happening. So I think we're still in a place where it's regarded as a sort of a lesser disposable genre.
Yeah.
But I think that it's going to break out into greater literary regard, basically.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, have you got any upcoming projects that you can tease us with?
Yeah, absolutely. I brought them along, but the podcast is just audio, right?
It is, yeah.
Okay. All right. So then I'll just look at them. Actually, the next thing that I have coming out is actually an anthology that I edited, which is called The Perfectly Fine Neighborhood. And this has got, speaking of, as I was earlier, Brian Keene, another great writing hero of mine, Jeff Strand, Candace Nola, Bev Vincent, a bunch of big names in this one, as well as we also have brand new authors who published in here for the first time. So this is an anthology. It's set in the world of The Perfectly Fine House, which I wrote with Wiley Young, and it really runs the gamut. It's really got some extreme splatterpunk stories in it. It's also got some very quiet, almost like Shirley Jackson, ghostly spectral horror. It's a really great anthology, and I'm hoping that it does really well. Like I said, especially for our debut authors that are in it. And I'm also very proud of it. I put a ton of work into this personally. I didn't do it all by myself. I also worked with Wiley Young and Kaylee Dobbs of Happy Goat Horror, where we all spent a long time putting a ton of effort into this book, and we really hope it blows up. So that's in the short term. That's coming out October 1st, and I'm guessing by the time you hear this interview, it will already be out. The next thing, I have a couple more collaborations coming out in the near future. So with Gavin Dillinger, who's also in The Perfectly Fine Neighborhood, we are going to be releasing a collaboration. Tentatively, we're calling it Looney, and it is a extreme horror piece about cartoons like Looney Tunes or Disney cartoons coming into the real world. So it's kind of like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's not quite that noir aspect, but it's about evil cartoons, which we were both we really wanted to revisit some of the tropes of your Porky Pigs and your Mickey Mouses, and like what would that actually look like in the real world. And considering they were all created in like the 1920s and 1930s, now that it's been almost a century, how do those characters hold up? I'll also be revisiting with my other collaborator, Stevie Kopus. We're going to be doing another novella set in the world of /Fiverr. And that will be out for next year's Scares That Cares Author Con, where I actually convinced Stevie to come out. So we're going to be sharing a table there, and that'll be our big debut for that. And then my next solo venture, well, I mean, I don't know if it'll be my next solo venture, but the latest extreme horror novel that I've completed, and I'm shopping around to agents right now.
Yeah.
I'm calling it Canceled with Extreme Prejudice, and I'm very proud of this one. And my assistant actually told me, she said, if this one isn't your big breakthrough, I have no faith in the reading world, or something, words to that effect. But what this one is about is this very ordinary, very unassuming traveling salesman. He just goes from place to place. And one night, it's almost run off the road. And he's very shaken. He's never had anything like this happen to him before. And he pulls off into a rest stop on the edge of the highway. And he goes into the rest stop. And while he's there, another person, a separate person, comes in and threatens his life as well. And so now he's been attacked and almost killed twice in one night.
Yeah.
And he goes home and he doesn't understand what's going on or why random people are attacking him. And eventually he finds out that there is a serial killer. There is a mobile serial killer. And somewhere way down deep on, Reddit and 8chan, a couple of enterprising internet sleuths have decided that it's him, because he's a traveling salesman. So they're like, oh, well, the killer struck here and this guy was here. And so he's basically been accused of being a serial killer. So all of there are now real world vigilantes coming out to get him. And he didn't do anything wrong. So it's gonna be really extreme and really horrific. And like I said, some people think it's my masterpiece. So Ed Lee, I asked Ed Lee for a blurb, and he rather enjoyed it. So
brilliant. Well, I hope it does really well for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Stephen, for sharing all your thoughts and your visions for us. That was brilliant. And thank you for giving us a bit of a glimpse into the author behind the books.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for accepting my offer to come on the podcast. That was brilliant. So thank you very much for that as well. Stay tuned, dear listeners, for more spine-tingling tales and dark discussions in a world of extreme horror. Until next time, remember the nightmares are real. And here on Unveiling Nightmares, we're crafting nightmares one tale at a time.